The crisp London morning air carried the sounds of thousands of voices, speaking in dozens of languages, as tourists from around the world gathered in the sprawling courtyard of Buckingham Palace. The ancient cobblestones, worn smooth by centuries, of footsteps reflected the golden rays of sunlight that filtered through the light clouds above. Among the sea of eager faces, cameras, and guidebooks, stood the Thompson family from Columbus, Ohio, who had spent months planning and saving for this once-in-a-lifetime European vacation. Marcus Thompson, owner, stood with his arms crossed, surveying the scene with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. His weathered hands, scarred from years of manual labor, gripped an expensive camera that his wife had insisted he bring. Marcus was a man who prided himself on his practical, no-nonsense approach to life. He had built his small construction business from nothing, working 16-hour days and earning every dollar through sweat and determination. To him, ceremonies and traditions often seemed like unnecessary pageantry, especially when they involved what he considered playing dress-up. "I still don't understand why we had to get up at 6 a.m. for this," Marcus muttered to his wife, adjusting his baseball cap against the morning sun. "It's just a bunch of guys in funny hats marching around. We could have watched it." On YouTube from the hotel room, his voice carried the slight edge of someone who was trying to be patient but found the whole experience somewhat ridiculous. Sarah Thompson, an elementary school teacher with infinite patience developed through years of managing a classroom full of energetic children, smiled warmly at her husband while keeping a gentle but firm hand on his arm. She had learned over their 15 years of marriage that Marcus's gruff exterior often masked a deeper curiosity about the world. "Because, honey," she said softly, "some things need to be experienced in person. Emma will remember this for the rest of her life. Besides, you promised you'd keep an open mind about British culture." Their 8-year-old daughter Emma bounced excitedly between her parents, her blonde pigtails swaying as she tried to see over the crowd of adults. She wore a small Union Jack t-shirt that Sarah had bought for her at Heathrow Airport, and her blue eyes sparkled with the wonder that only children can truly experience when encountering something completely new. "Mommy, when do the guards come?" "Out. Are they really going to have those big fuzzy hats? Will they talk to me if I wave at them?" At their feet, connected by a sturdy leather leash wrapped around Marcus's wrist, stood Bruno, their 3-year-old English Bulldog. The 70-pound canine was a study in muscular determination, with a wrinkled face that seemed permanently set in a serious expression. Bruno had been rescued from an animal shelter in Cincinnati, where he had been surrendered by a previous owner who couldn't handle his protective instincts and stubborn personality. The dog had initially struggled with trust issues, particularly around strangers in uniforms, but had gradually become a beloved family member who was fiercely loyal to the Thompsons. The process of bringing Bruno to Europe had been complicated and expensive, requiring months of veterinary appointments, paperwork, and special travel arrangements. Sarah had initially opposed the idea, but Emma had been heartbroken at the thought of leaving her beloved pet behind for 2 weeks. Marcus, despite his practical nature, had a soft spot for his daughter's tears and had spent considerable time and money ensuring Bruno could accompany them on their adventure. As the minutes ticked by, the crowd grew larger and more densely packed. Tourists jostled for better positions. Tour guides spoke in animated voices about the history and significance of the ceremony, and street vendors hawked souvenirs and bottled water. The atmosphere was festive but also charged with anticipation. As thousands of people waited for the famous changing of the guard ceremony to begin, Bruno began showing signs of unease as more people pressed closer around them. His breathing became heavier, and his normally relaxed demeanor shifted to something more alert and watchful. The Bulldog had never been comfortable in large crowds. The formal atmosphere, combined with the increasing noise and press of bodies, was triggering his protective instincts. "Easy, boy," Marcus said absently, more focused on the scene unfolding before them than on his pet's growing agitation. He was scanning the palace grounds, trying to understand what all the fuss was about. To his eyes, the whole setup seemed like an elaborate show put on for tourists, a way to separate visitors from their money while perpetuating what he saw as outdated traditions, Sarah noticed. Bruno's change in behavior before her husband did. Marcus Bruno seems nervous. Maybe we should move to a spot with less crowd pressure. She had developed a keen awareness of the dog's moods and knew that he could become unpredictable when stressed. But Marcus was too focused on the impending ceremony to pay proper attention to her concerns. At precisely 11 o'clock, the sound of military drums began to echo across the courtyard, and the crowd fell into a respectful hush. From the direction of St. James's Palace, a column of red-uniformed guards appeared, their movements synchronized with mechanical precision. The famous household division, resplendent in their scarlet tunics and towering bearskin caps, marched in perfect formation across the courtyard. The tourists pressed forward for better views, cameras clicking and phones recording as the guards took their positions. The ceremony was indeed impressive, even to Marcus's skeptical eye. The precision of their movements, the weight of centuries of tradition, and the pageantry of it all created an undeniably powerful spectacle. Young Emma was completely entranced, her small face pressed against the rope barrier as she watched the guards with wide-eyed wonder. "Daddy, they're like toy soldiers come to life," she whispered excitedly. "But why don't they smile? Are they sad?" Marcus chuckled at his daughter's innocent question, and it was then that his attention focused on one particular guard who had taken a position directly in front of their section of the crowd. The young soldier stood at perfect attention, his rifle held at precisely the correct angle, his eyes focused straight ahead with unwavering discipline. This was James Mitchell, a 24-year-old guardsman who had been serving in the prestigious Queen's Guard for nearly 2 years. James came from a long line of military service members. His grandfather had served in the same regiment during the 1960s. His father had been a career Army officer, and his older brother was currently deployed with the Royal Marines. For James, wearing the red tunic and bearskin cap wasn't just a job or a tourist attraction. It was the continuation of a family legacy and a personal honor that he took with utmost seriousness. James had undergone months of rigorous training. To earn his position, physical demands were intense, requiring him to stand motionless for hours at a time while maintaining perfect posture and military bearing. More challenging still were the mental requirements: absolute focus, unwavering discipline, and the ability to ignore any distraction or provocation from the thousands of tourists who observed the guards daily. During his time on duty, James had dealt with every imaginable attempt by tourists to break his composure. He had been photographed, filmed, shouted at, and subjected to various pranks and disruptions. Children had tried to talk to him. Teenagers had attempted to make him laugh. Adults had sometimes behaved inappropriately in attempts to get a reaction. Through it all, James maintained his professional demeanor. Understanding that he represented not just himself but centuries of British military tradition, Marcus studied the young guard with growing interest, his contractor's eye automatically assessing the man's bearing and demeanor. "Look at that one, Emma," he said, pointing directly at James. "He's trying so hard to look serious and important, but I bet if we tried, we could get him to crack a smile, or at least move a little bit." Sarah felt a familiar knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. She recognized the tone in her husband's voice, the same one he used when he was planning one of his practical jokes or when he decided to prove a point about something. "Marcus, please don't start anything," she said quietly. "These men are doing their job. Let them do it with dignity." But Marcus was already formulating a plan, his mind working the way it did when he encountered any challenge or problem that needed solving. He had built his business by being bold, by not accepting conventional wisdom at face value, and by proving that things weren't always as they appeared. To him, these guards were just people in costumes, and he was confident he could demonstrate that to his daughter and anyone else who was watching. "These guys are trained to ignore everything," Marcus explained to Emma, his voice carrying clearly to the nearby tourists who were beginning to take notice of his commentary. "They're supposed to stand there like statues no matter what happens around them. But they're just regular people underneath those fancy uniforms. I bet I could get that one to react if I really tried." Bruno, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly agitated by the combination of the crowd. The formal military atmosphere and his owner's changing energy, the Bulldog's protective instincts, honed through his difficult early life, were telling him that something was wrong. The uniformed figures, the tense atmosphere, Marcus's obvious focus on one particular guard were all triggering responses that had been shaped by his troubled past. The dog began to pace restlessly within the confines of his leash, his muscular body tense and ready. His breathing became more labored, and his dark eyes constantly scanned the scene for potential threats to his beloved family. Other tourists nearby began to notice the dog's behavior, some stepping slightly away as they sensed his growing unease. "Marcus, I really think we should move to a different spot," Sarah said more urgently, her teacher's instincts recognizing the signs of a situation that was beginning to spiral beyond anyone's control. "Bruno's getting worked up, and Emma's getting tired. Maybe we could find somewhere quieter to watch from." But Marcus was too focused on his intended target to pay proper attention to his wife's concerns or his dog's behavior. He was studying James Mitchell with the intensity of someone planning a construction project, analyzing weak points and figuring out the best approach to achieve his objective. The challenge had captured his imagination completely, and his practical mind was already working out the details of how to prove his point about the artificial nature of British military ceremony. The stage was set for a confrontation that would transform not only the Thompson family's understanding of duty and honor, but would also create ripple effects that would be felt far beyond the ancient walls of Buckingham Palace. What Marcus intended as a simple demonstration of his thesis about the arbitrary nature of tradition was about to become a profound lesson in the true meaning of strength, compassion, and human dignity. The tension in the courtyard was palpable. As Marcus Thompson made his fateful decision, the morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, casting harsh shadows across the ancient stones of Buckingham Palace, and the crowd of tourists had swelled to nearly 3,000 people from every corner of the globe. The air buzzed with excitement and anticipation, but in the small space occupied by the Thompson family, a different kind of energy was building, one that would soon explode into chaos. Marcus looked down at Bruno, who had been growing increasingly restless as the ceremony progressed. The Bulldog's normally relaxed demeanor had transformed into something more primal and alert. His thick, muscular neck was rigid with tension. His wrinkled face was set in an expression of barely controlled aggression, and his dark eyes constantly scanned the uniformed figures that surrounded them. The dog's breathing had become labored, each exhalation creating small puffs of vapor in the cool morning air. Bruno's past experiences had shaped his responses to situations like this. During his early life, before the Thompsons rescued him from the shelter, he had been mistreated by several people in uniforms, animal control officers who had handled him roughly, veterinarians who had approached him with fear rather than kindness, and previous owners who had used intimidation rather than positive reinforcement. These memories, buried deep in his canine consciousness, were now surfacing as he observed the formal military setting and sensed his owner's growing agitation. "You see, Emma," Marcus said, his voice carrying a tone of confident authority that he typically reserved for explaining construction projects to his crew. "These guards are all just for show. They're like actors in a play, pretending to be something they're not. Watch what happens when we give them a little test of reality." His words were spoken loud enough for the tourists around them to hear, and several people turned their attention. From the ceremony to the American family and their increasingly restless dog, Sarah felt her heart rate accelerating as she recognized the familiar signs of her husband's stubborn determination. Over the years, she had watched Marcus approach challenges with the same single-minded focus that had made him successful in business. But it also led to several embarrassing incidents during their marriage. There was the time he had challenged a mime in Central Park to break character, the incident at Disney World where he had tried to prove that Mickey Mouse was just a teenager in a costume. Countless other moments where his need to prove a point had created uncomfortable situations. "Marcus, please," she whispered urgently, gripping his arm with both hands and trying to pull him back from the rope barrier. "You're making people stare. Emma's getting scared, and Bruno is acting strange. Can we please just enjoy the ceremony like everyone else?" Her voice carried the pleading tone of someone who had been through similar situations before. and knew how they typically ended. But Marcus was beyond listening to reason. His contractor's mind had identified what he saw as a structural weakness in the pageantry before him, and he was determined to expose it. To him, the elaborate ceremony represented everything he disliked about old-world traditions: expensive, impractical, and ultimately meaningless displays that served no real purpose in the modern world. Emma, sensing the growing tension between her parents, began to fidget nervously. The 8-year-old had been thoroughly enjoying the spectacle of the changing guard ceremony, marveling at the precision of the marching soldiers and the grandeur of their uniforms. But now the excitement was being replaced by anxiety as she watched her father's behavior and felt her mother's distress. "Daddy, what's wrong with Bruno?" she asked in a small voice. Noticing how their beloved pet was behaving in ways she had never seen before, the Bulldog had begun to exhibit classic signs of canine stress and aggression. His ears were pinned back against his broad skull, his tail had become rigid and was held high in a dominant posture, and low growling sounds were emanating from deep in his chest. The other tourists in their immediate vicinity were beginning to notice Bruno's behavior, and were subtly shifting their positions to create more distance between themselves and the increasingly agitated animal. James Mitchell, the young guard, who had become the unwitting target of Marcus's attention, continued to maintain his position with unwavering discipline. From his perspective, the morning had been proceeding normally. He had taken his post at the designated time, assumed the proper stance, and begun the mental exercise of maintaining perfect composure while thousands of tourists observed and photographed him. James had developed techniques. Over his 2 years of service for dealing with the constant scrutiny and occasional disruptions, he focused his mind on positive memories, conversations with his grandfather about the honor of serving in the Queen's Guard, describing the importance of maintaining traditions that connected them to their military heritage, and his own sense of pride in being entrusted with such a prestigious duty. But something was different about this particular morning. James could sense a change in the energy of the crowd directly in front of his position. His peripheral vision, trained through months of practice to observe without appearing to look, had detected the increasingly animated behavior of the American tourist and his family. More concerning was his awareness of the dog, whose body language James recognized as potentially dangerous. During his military training, James had completed courses in threat assessment and crowd control. Part of that training had included instruction on reading animal behavior, as military personnel often encountered aggressive dogs during their service. The signs that Bruno was displaying the rigid posture, the constant pacing within the confines of his leash, the low vocalizations were all indicators that the animal was approaching a state where it might act. Unpredictably, Marcus, oblivious to the professional assessment his behavior was receiving from the trained soldier, made his decision with the confidence of someone who had never encountered a situation he couldn't handle through force of personality and determination. He looked down at Bruno, who was now panting heavily and showing clear signs of distress, and saw an opportunity to prove his point about the artificial nature of military discipline. "Go on, Bruno," Marcus whispered, his voice taking on the encouraging tone he typically used when teaching the dog new tricks or encouraging him to overcome obstacles. "Go say hello to the nice guard." As he spoke, Marcus began to loosen his grip on Bruno's leash, not releasing it entirely, but allowing the dog significantly more freedom of movement than he had previously permitted. The effect of Marcus's words and actions on Bruno was immediate and alarming. The Bulldog, already stressed by the crowd and the formal atmosphere, interpreted his master's encouragement as permission to act on his protective instincts. In Bruno's mind, the uniformed figure standing rigidly in front of them represented a potential threat to his beloved family, and Marcus's words were authorization to neutralize that threat. Sarah realized what was happening a split second before it occurred. "Marcus, no," she screamed, lunging forward to grab the leash from her husband's hand, but her warning came too late. Bruno, with the explosive speed that only a highly motivated Bulldog could achieve, broke free from Marcus's loosened grip and charged directly toward guard James Mitchell. The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. Gasps of horror and surprise rippled through the tourists as they witnessed the powerful dog racing toward the motionless guard. Some people screamed, others stumbled backward in their haste to get out of the way, and many fumbled for their phones to record what promised to be either a spectacular confrontation or a tragic accident. Bruno's charge across the courtyard was a study in focused aggression. 70-pound Bulldog moved with surprising speed, his low center of gravity giving him stability as he navigated through the forest of tourist legs and camera equipment. His powerful jaw was slightly open, revealing teeth that had been bred for gripping and holding. And his breathing had become the heavy, determined panting of an animal in full pursuit mode. The security personnel stationed around the ceremony perimeter immediately recognized the crisis unfolding before them.
Ow.
Radio chatter erupted as they coordinated their response to the unprecedented situation of a tourist's dog attacking a ceremonial guard. Training had prepared them for many types of disruptions, but a canine assault on one of Her Majesty's guards presented unique challenges that required careful consideration of both public safety and diplomatic implications. James Mitchell, meanwhile, found himself facing the ultimate test of his training and character. Every instinct screamed at him to move, to defend himself, to step aside or raise his rifle to ward off the approaching threat. The sound of Bruno's claws on the ancient stones grew louder with each passing second, and James could hear the chaos erupting in the crowd around him. But James remained motionless, his military training overriding his natural survival instincts. He had sworn an oath to maintain his post and uphold the dignity of his position, regardless of circumstances. And that oath now faced its greatest test. As Bruno closed the final yards between them, James made a conscious decision that would define not only his own character, but would also create a moment that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. The collision of two different worlds, the disciplined, tradition-bound realm of military service, and the chaotic, unpredictable world of human ignorance and animal instinct, was about to occur in full view of thousands of witnesses, creating a moment that would challenge everyone present to reconsider their assumptions about strength, dignity, and the true meaning of heroism. The confrontation between Bruno and guard James Mitchell reached its most critical and dangerous moment as the Bulldog's aggression escalated to levels that terrified everyone watching. The courtyard, which moments before had been filled with the pleasant sounds of tourist conversation and camera clicks, was now dominated by Bruno's fierce barking and the collective gasps of 3,000 horrified onlookers. Bruno had positioned himself directly in front of James, his powerful body coiled like a spring ready to launch another attack. The Bulldog's muscular frame was trembling with adrenaline and barely contained fury. His wrinkled face was contorted with aggression. His dark eyes locked onto James's face with an intensity that spoke of primal instincts overtaking rational thought. Saliva dripped from his slightly open mouth, and his breathing had become the harsh, rhythmic panting of an animal in full combat mode. The dog began a series of increasingly bold and dangerous maneuvers, each one designed to provoke a response. From the motionless guard, Bruno would charge forward, stop just inches from James's legs, rear up on his hind legs with surprising agility for his stocky build, and snap his powerful jaws mere centimeters from the guard's red tunic. The sound of his teeth clicking together echoed across the silent courtyard like a metronome counting down to disaster. James Mitchell, meanwhile, was experiencing the most challenging test of his military career and personal character. Standing at perfect attention while a 70-pound Bulldog launched, repeated attacks required not just physical discipline, but extraordinary mental fortitude. Every survival instinct that millions of years of human evolution had programmed into his DNA was screaming at him to move, to defend himself, to step away from the immediate danger. The young guard could feel every detail of Bruno's assault with terrifying clarity. The dog's hot breath on his legs carried the smell of morning treats and anxiety-induced panting. The scratching sound of Bruno's claws on the ancient stones sent vibrations through the ground that James could feel through his polished military boots. When Bruno jumped, James could sense the displacement of air and feel the heat radiating from the animal's muscular body. As it passed within inches of his face, sweat had begun to form under James's heavy bearskin hat trickling down his face and neck despite the cool morning air. The formal red tunic, designed for ceremony rather than combat, felt restrictive and vulnerable as Bruno's teeth snapped dangerously close to the fabric. James's heart was pounding with such intensity that he was certain everyone in the courtyard must be able to hear it, yet his external appearance remained absolutely unchanged. The crowd's reaction had evolved from initial shock to something approaching awe as they witnessed James's incredible display of self-control. Mobile phones were recording from every angle, capturing footage that would soon spread across social media platforms worldwide. Tour guides stood speechless, their prepared scripts about British military traditions suddenly seeming inadequate. To describe what they were witnessing, an elderly veteran in the crowd, a man who had served in the Royal Navy during the Falklands War, found himself wiping tears from his eyes as he watched the young guard's display of discipline. "That's what real courage looks like," he whispered to his wife. "Not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it." His words carried to the tourists around him, adding to the growing sense that they were witnessing something truly extraordinary. Marcus Thompson stood frozen in horror and disbelief as he watched his harmless prank transform into a potentially deadly situation. The construction worker who had prided himself on his ability to handle any situation found himself completely powerless to control the chaos he had unleashed. His hands shook as he called Bruno's name repeatedly, but his voice was lost in the din of the crowd and his dog's aggressive barking. "Bruno, come back here! Stop it, Bruno!" Marcus's voice cracked with desperation as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. The confident, somewhat arrogant man who had approached the ceremony with skepticism and superiority now felt smaller and more helpless than he had ever felt in his adult life. The weight of responsibility for what was happening pressed down on him like a physical force. Sarah Thompson was experiencing every parent's worst nightmare as she watched her family's beloved pet behave in ways that seemed completely foreign to his normal personality. She clutched Emma tightly against her, sighed, trying to shield her daughter from the full horror of the situation, while simultaneously feeling helpless to intervene. "I'm so sorry," she kept repeating to anyone within earshot, though her words seemed pitifully inadequate given the circumstances. 8-year-old Emma was crying uncontrollably, her small body shaking with sobs as she witnessed her beloved Bruno acting like a monster from her worst nightmares. "Why is Bruno being mean?" she wailed, burying her face in her mother's jacket. "Make him stop, Mommy. Make him be nice again." The child's innocent distress added another layer of emotional complexity to an already overwhelming situation. The palace security forces had mobilized with military precision, but their response was complicated by the unique nature of the threat. Standard protocols for dealing with aggressive animals typically involved immediate containment or neutralization. But the presence of thousands of tourists, international media, the ceremonial context created diplomatic and practical challenges that required careful consideration. Captain Morrison, the senior security officer coordinating the response, spoke rapidly into his radio as he assessed the situation. "We need animal control specialists here immediately, but we also need to consider the international implications. This is being broadcast live on several networks, and any use of force against a tourist pet could create a diplomatic incident." His voice carried the tension of someone trying to balance multiple competing priorities. Under extreme pressure, Bruno's attacks were becoming more focused and dangerous with each passing moment. The Bulldog seemed to interpret James's complete stillness as either cowardice or defiance, both of which triggered deeper levels of his protective programming. He began timing his leaps to coincide with James's breathing, as if trying to catch the guard at a moment of vulnerability. In one particularly terrifying moment, Bruno managed to jump high enough that his teeth actually made contact with the red fabric of James's tunic, tearing a small hole in the historic uniform. The crowd gasped collectively at this escalation, many people certain that the next leap would result in serious injury to the young guard. James felt the tug on his uniform, in the brief contact with Bruno's teeth, but his expression remained absolutely neutral. He had entered a state of mental focus that transcended normal human experience. Drawing on reserves of discipline and determination that he had developed through years of military training and family tradition, the young guard was no longer just representing himself or even his regiment. He had become a living symbol of everything that military service represented. The moment had arrived when something had to give. Bruno was working himself into a frenzy that could only end in either exhaustion or a successful attack on James. The crowd held its collective breath. Security forces prepared to intervene, and the world watched through countless camera lenses as this unprecedented confrontation approached its climax. It was then that James Mitchell made a decision that would transform him from a ceremonial guard into a legend, and would teach everyone present a lesson about the true meaning of strength, wisdom, and human dignity. Instead of maintaining his silence or waiting for security to intervene, James chose to do something that no one expected. Something that would demonstrate that real power lies not in force or rigid adherence to rules, but in the courage to show compassion in the face of aggression. The situation reached a critical point as Bruno's aggression intensified. The Bulldog, frustrated by the guard's complete lack of response, began to jump higher and bark more ferociously. His powerful jaw snapped inches from James's red tunic, and his claws scratched against the stone pavement as he tried to gain purchase for another leap. Palace security was now rushing toward the scene, but they were still several yards away. The crowd had formed a wide circle around the incident, with many tourists recording the extraordinary display of discipline they were witnessing. Children cried while adults watched in mixture of horror and amazement. Marcus finally broke from his paralysis and began calling Bruno's name desperately. "Bruno, come here! Bruno, stop!" But the dog was too focused on the guard to respond to his owner's commands. The Bulldog had entered what trainers call a focused state, where external commands become secondary to the immediate objective. Sarah grabbed Marcus's arm with both hands, her fingernails digging into his skin. "Do something," she screamed, tears streaming down her face. "He's going to bite the guard," Emma continued sobbing, confused and frightened by the chaos that had erupted around their family vacation. James could feel his heart pounding beneath his red tunic, but his breathing remained controlled. He had been taught that a Queen's Guard represents centuries of British military tradition and must never break character regardless of personal danger. His grandfather had served in the same position during the 1960s and had told him stories about maintaining composure under pressure, but nothing had prepared him for this. Bruno made one final desperate leap toward James's face, his teeth bared, and his eyes locked on the guard's stoic expression. For a moment, it seemed inevitable that the dog would make contact, potentially causing serious injury and creating an international incident that would embarrass both the tourist family and the British military. But then something remarkable happened. As Bruno reached the peak of his jump, mere inches from James's face, the guard did something completely unexpected. Instead of flinching or stepping back, James did something that no one in the crowd anticipated. He spoke. Not in anger or fear, but in a calm, gentle voice that cut through all the chaos and noise. "Easy, boy," James said softly, his eyes still looking straight ahead, but his voice directed at the agitated animal. "Easy there, Bruno." The effect was immediate and startling. Bruno, who had been in full aggressive mode just seconds before, suddenly stopped his attack. The Bulldog landed on all four paws and looked up at James with confusion, his head tilted, as if trying to understand what had just happened. The crowd fell silent, stunned by this unexpected turn of events. Even the approaching security guards slowed their pace, realizing that something extraordinary was taking place. Marcus stopped shouting and stood with his mouth open, unable to believe what he was seeing. "That's a good boy," James continued, still maintaining his formal posture, but speaking in soothing tones. "You're just protecting your family, aren't you? That's what good dogs do." His voice carried no trace of anger or fear, only understanding and compassion. Bruno's aggressive posture began to soften. His ears, which had been pinned back against his head, started to relax. The dog's breathing slowed, and his tail, which had been rigid with tension, gave a tentative wag. The Bulldog seemed to recognize something in James's voice that transcended the formal uniform and ceremony. "You're a brave dog, Bruno, James. said, using the name he had heard Marcus calling. "But your family needs you to be calm now. Can you do that for them?" The guard's tone was that of someone who genuinely understood and respected animals, not someone trying to avoid danger. The transformation in Bruno was remarkable. The dog, who had been aggressively attacking just moments before, now sat down in front of the guard, looking up at him with what could only be described as respect. His tail wagged more confidently, and his breathing returned to normal. The crowd watched in amazement as this unexpected connection formed between the disciplined soldier and the confused animal. What had started as a potential disaster was becoming something beautiful and profound, demonstrating a level of compassion and understanding that none of the tourists had expected to witness during their visit to Buckingham Palace. The courtyard remained eerily quiet as tourists and security personnel watched the incredible scene unfold. Bruno sat perfectly still in front of James, as if the guard had cast a spell over the previously aggressive animal. The bulldog's eyes remained fixed on James's face, showing a level of respect and attention that amazed everyone present. James continued speaking in his calm, steady voice while maintaining his ceremonial position. "I had a dog like you once, Bruno," he said softly, his words carrying across the silent courtyard. "A boxer named Wellington. He was protective too, always wanted to make sure his family was safe." The guard's eyes remained focused straight ahead, but his voice conveyed genuine warmth and understanding. Marcus felt his anger and embarrassment transform into something else entirely, shame mixed with profound respect. He had expected the guard to break character, to show weakness or fear, but instead he was witnessing a display of strength and compassion that went far beyond anything he had imagined possible. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes, overwhelmed by the guard's kindness in the face of such a frightening situation. She had been terrified that Bruno might seriously injure the young soldier. But instead of anger or retaliation, James had shown nothing but understanding and gentleness. "Wellington taught me that dogs don't attack because they're mean," James continued, his voice just loud enough for the nearby crowd to hear. "They attack because they love their families so much, they'll do anything to protect them. Just like you, Bruno. You love your family, don't you?" Bruno's tail wagged more enthusiastically, and he made a soft whining sound that seemed almost like an apology. The dog appeared to understand that this uniformed human was not a threat, but rather someone who genuinely cared about him and his family. Emma stopped crying and moved closer to her parents, fascinated by the connection forming between her families, dog and the guard. "Mommy," she whispered, "why is Bruno being so good now?" Sarah knelt down and hugged her daughter, struggling to find words to explain the remarkable scene they were witnessing. The palace security guards had reached the area but made no move to intervene. They could see that the situation was under control and that their colleague was handling it with extraordinary skill and composure. Their respect for James, already high due to his reputation as a dedicated soldier, grew even more as they watched him manage this unprecedented situation. "Your little girl there?" James said, somehow having noticed Emma despite maintaining his forward gaze. "She must be very special to have such a loyal protector." Wellington always had a soft spot for children too. He knew they needed extra protection. His ability to remain aware of his surroundings while maintaining perfect military bearing impressed even the experienced security personnel. Marcus found his voice again, but this time it was quiet and humble. "Bruno," he called softly, "come here, boy." To everyone's amazement, Bruno looked back at Marcus, then up at James, as if asking permission to return to his family. "Go ahead, Bruno," James said gently. "Your family needs you, and they're safe. Now, thank you for protecting them so well." The dog stood up slowly, gave James one last look of what seemed like gratitude, and trotted back to Marcus with his tail wagging peacefully. As Bruno reached his family, Marcus bent down and attached the leash with shaking hands. The tough construction worker who had started this incident as a joke now found himself speechless in the face of such grace under pressure. He looked up at James, wanting to apologize, to thank him, to somehow express the profound impact this a moment had made on him and his family. The crowd began to murmur in amazement, with many tourists wiping away tears. They had come to see a changing of the guard ceremony, but instead they had witnessed something far more meaningful, a demonstration of true strength, compassion, and dignity under the most challenging circumstances. James remained at perfect attention, his posture unchanged, his rifle held at the precise angle required by centuries of military tradition. But everyone present knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary, a moment that transcended the formal ceremony and touched the very heart of what it means to serve with honor and humanity. Marcus stood with Bruno's leash firmly in his hand, struggling to find words adequate to express his emotions. The crowd around them began to shift, some tourists approaching cautiously while others maintained respectful distance. The atmosphere had completely transformed from one of chaos and fear to something resembling reverence and wonder. "Sir," Marcus finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the quiet courtyard. I need to apologize. What I did was wrong, and you." He paused, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he had just witnessed. "You showed more grace and strength than I've ever seen in my life." James remained at attention, unable to acknowledge the apology directly due to his ceremonial duties. But the slight relaxation in his shoulders suggested he had heard and understood, as the guard's commanding officer, who had been observing from a distance, made a mental note of the extraordinary way his soldier had handled this unprecedented situation. Sarah stepped forward, tears still flowing down her cheeks. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for being so kind to our dog, and for showing us what real dignity looks like." Emma nodded vigorously beside her mother, having gained a new understanding of what it meant to be truly brave and gentle at the same time. An elderly British woman in the crowd approached the Thompson family with a warm smile. "Your guard there," she said, nodding toward James, "has just shown you the very best of what we British value: duty, compassion, and grace under pressure. You've witnessed something quite special today." Her words carried the weight of someone who understood the significance of what had just occurred. Other tourists began sharing their amazement at what they had witnessed. A young man from Germany shook his head in disbelief. "My country, we have many traditions, but I have never seen such composure and kindness in the face of danger. This guard is truly remarkable." His girlfriend nodded in agreement. Still recording the peaceful scene on her phone, Marcus found himself looking at James with new eyes. The guard he had initially dismissed as merely someone playing dress-up had revealed himself to be a person of extraordinary character and strength. The American tourist realized that his own prejudices and assumptions had blinded him to the true meaning of the ceremony he had come to mock. "Bruno seems to understand something we adults sometimes forget," observed a middle-aged woman from Canada who had been watching the entire incident. "Respect isn't about being afraid of someone. It's about recognizing their worth and character. That dog knows he's in the presence of someone special." Indeed, Bruno remained calm and content beside his family, occasionally looking back at James with what appeared to be genuine affection. The Bulldog's complete transformation from aggressor to admirer seemed to symbolize the profound impact the guard's response had made on everyone present. The palace security guards began to discreetly manage the crowd, ensuring that normal operations could resume while respecting the emotional significance of the moment. Their colleagues' handling of the situation had not only prevented a potential disaster, but had created an opportunity for genuine human connection and understanding. A photographer who had been covering the ceremony for a local paper approached Marcus carefully. "Excuse me, sir, but would you mind if I interviewed you about what happened here? I think this story could help people understand the true meaning of service and dignity." Marcus nodded, realizing that sharing this experience might help others learn what he had just discovered. James continued his duty with unwavering professionalism. But those who knew him well could see the subtle signs of someone who had been deeply moved by the encounter. His fellow guards would later describe how this incident reinforced their own commitment to the values they had sworn to uphold. As the formal ceremony resumed around them, the Thompson family found themselves seeing everything with new appreciation. The precision of the guards' movements, the dignity of their bearing, and the weight of the traditions they represented took on deeper meaning after witnessing one guard's extraordinary response to an unexpected challenge. Emma tugged at her father's sleeve again. But this time, her question was different. "Daddy, can we come back tomorrow to see the nice guard again?" Marcus smiled through his tears, knowing that this experience had changed not only his own understanding, but had given his daughter a powerful example of what it meant to serve others with honor and compassion. As the ceremony drew to a close, the Thompson family remained in the courtyard longer than they had originally planned. Marcus found himself unable to leave without somehow properly acknowledging what James had done for them. He approached one of the palace security officers who had witnessed the entire incident. "Excuse me," Marcus said respectfully. "Is there any way I could thank that guard properly? It's what he did for my family." It changed everything. The security officer, impressed by the tourist's sincerity, explained that while guards on duty couldn't engage in conversations, there were appropriate channels for expressing gratitude. The news photographer conducted a brief interview with Marcus, who struggled to articulate the profound impact the experience had made on him. "I came here as a skeptic," he admitted, his voice still shaky with emotion. "I thought these guards were just for show, just playing dress-up for tourists. But that young man showed me what real strength looks like." He could have been angry. He could have been frightened, but instead he chose compassion. Word of the incident began to spread among the tourists and palace staff. James's supervisor approached him during a brief break between ceremonies, offering quiet words of commendation for his exceptional handling of the situation. "That was textbook crisis management, Mitchell," the officer said. "But more than that, it was a perfect example of what we stand for." Sarah spent time talking with Emma about what they had witnessed, helping her daughter understand the importance of treating others with respect and kindness, even when they behave badly toward you. "That guard could have been mean to Bruno," Sarah explained, "but instead he was gentle and understanding. That's how we should try to treat others, even when they're not nice to us first." Bruno seemed to sense the emotional weight of the moment, staying close to his family, but remaining calm and well-behaved. Several other tourists commented on the dramatic change in the dog's demeanor, noting how he appeared almost protective of the guard's dignity now rather than threatening it. As they prepared to leave, Marcus made a decision that surprised even himself. He approached a souvenir vendor and purchased a small British flag pin. Not as a tourist trinket, but as a symbol of his newfound respect for what he had witnessed. He attached it to his jacket, knowing he would wear it proudly and remember this day whenever he saw it. The story of the incident began to spread through social media. As tourists shared their videos and photos of the remarkable encounter, comments poured in from around the world, with many people expressing amazement at the guard's composure and kindness. The hashtag guard and Bulldog began trending, bringing positive attention to the professionalism and humanity of the British military. 3 days later, Marcus received word through the palace's visitor relations department that James had accepted his written letter of apology and gratitude. The guard had also included a brief note expressing his hope that Bruno was doing well and that the family had enjoyed the rest of their visit to London. Emma insisted on drawing a picture of James in his red uniform, standing next to a smiling Bruno. She wanted to send it to the nice guard as a thank you gift. The drawing, while childlike in execution, captured perfectly the spirit of kindness and understanding that had transformed a potentially dangerous situation into a moment of genuine human connection. The Thompson family's remaining days in London were filled with new appreciation for British culture and traditions. They visited other historical sites with respect and curiosity rather than skepticism, and Marcus found himself sharing the story of their encounter with other tourists, encouraging them to see beyond the surface of ceremonial traditions to the dedicated individuals who maintain them years later. When people asked Marcus about his most memorable travel experience, he would always tell the story of guard James Mitchell and how a moment of poor judgment on his part had led to witnessing the most impressive display of character he had ever seen. The incident had taught him that true strength isn't about proving points or showing dominance, but about responding to challenges with grace, understanding, and compassion. Bruno lived many more years as a beloved family pet, but he never again showed aggression toward anyone in uniform. Marcus often joked that the Bulldog had learned the same lesson he had that day at Buckingham Palace, that real heroes don't need to prove their strength through force, but demonstrate it through their capacity for kindness and understanding. In the face of adversity, The story became a reminder to all who heard it that dignity, respect, and compassion are not signs of weakness, but the truest measures of strength. And that sometimes the most powerful response to aggression is not to fight back, but to respond with understanding and grace.